So today I want to look at this video from the Joe Rogan Experience, the YouTube channel, Powerful JRE. And look, if you don't know who Joe Rogan is, then maybe you need to crawl out of the rock you've been living under. So this is Joe Rogan. He had presidential candidates Rose Tico Kennedy Jr. on. Robert Kennedy Jr., sorry. And they were talking about Vietnam and the military-industrial complex. And I have a few things to say, so let's check it out.
My uncle, John Kennedy, did that. He refused to go to war. So he was surrounded by military-industrial complex. And
yeah, JFK. President JFK refused to go to war, but he was surrounded by the military-industrial complex. Woo!
And he learned very early and an intelligence apparatus that he realized early on that the purpose of the CIA and the intelligence apparatus was to create a constant pipeline of new wars for the military-industrial complex. The day, 3 days before he took...
Yeah, the military-industrial complex, they just want more war. Presumably so that a few weapons contractors can make a few extra dollars.
Office. Eisenhower, who was the outgoing president, gave what is probably the most important speech in American history, which was, where he warned against the military-industrial complex. I was at my uncle's inauguration.
Now, it's worth noting, because this whole perspective of the military-industrial complex, this didn't really start. This used to be just a fringe perspective amongst the political left, especially the Noam Chomsky types, people like Kyle Kalinske, Secular Talk, maybe the Young Turks and whatever left-wing commentators Russia Today was employing. This used to be a perspective that was espoused by the political left. And they act like that this whole disdain toward what's considered to be war profiteering started with Dwight Eisenhower and his farewell address. Maybe Eisenhower started the notion of some shadowy lobbyist in the background manipulating politicians so that we can get more war, so that they can make more money. But this disdain toward war profiteering did not start with Dwight Eisenhower in the late 1950s. If you recall, the movie The Aviator, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, is about the life of Howard Hughes. In that movie, Howard Hughes is dragged in front of Congress to explain his alleged war profiteering. Great scene, great movie. I highly recommend it if you haven't checked it out. Even there are even video clips of the actual hearings on YouTube that you can look up. And even before that, I remember the History Channel did a series called The Titans That Built America, and they talked about how during World War I and leading up to World War II, there was a lot of disdain toward war profiteering. A lot of the industrialists that helped out with the war effort during World War I and World War II were eventually smeared as using the war as an excuse to grease the taxpayers to make a few extra dollars. So I think it's worth noting that this did not exactly start with Dwight D. Eisenhower and his farewell address. And I also think it's interesting that just a few years ago, because again, this used to be a perspective that was considered fringe on the political left, but now we see the political right really embracing this perspective, especially since Tucker Carlson has become a thought leader for a lot of conservatives, since Tulsi Gabbard has become a recurring fill-in host on Fox News, and even Robert Kennedy Jr. He's been beloved and praised by a lot of people on the political right, and I think this is a reason why, especially since the Ukraine war started. You've heard a lot of contrarians really bringing up the military-industrial complex. And it was just a few years ago that a lot of people, when they watched this movie, The Last Jedi, at the time it was the newest Star Wars movie, and everyone seemed to be in agreement that this character, Rose Tico, was this annoying, unnecessary character. And I remember one of the complaints was that she was talking about how the real evil in the universe, in the Star Wars universe, it wasn't the Empire and their evil actions, but rather the real evil in the universe was weapons contractors. And now everyone talks like Rose Tico whenever foreign policy comes up. Everyone's talking about the horrors of weapons contractors and a military-industrial complex. Although the more I think about it, I think maybe you could say Rose Tico is actually a pretty good concretization of how annoying these people are. Especially with Rose, because I think it's clear that she's clearly in over her head with this myopic view that what really drives war is weapons contractors and a military-industrial complex. She clearly has no fucking clue what she's talking about. But now everyone. That's why I'm calling Robert Kennedy Jr. Rose Tico Kennedy Jr. Because he thinks and talks like Rose Tico from The Last Jedi.
I was in Washington that day. I was a 6-year-old boy. And I was sitting on the stands behind him, in front of him during his inauguration. And he understood that. And 2 months later, the military and intelligence came to him and said, we got to invade Cuba. And he was like, I'm not going to Cuba, and I'm not going to let the military. And they said, well, we got all these Cubans trained, and they're going to go attack Castro. And he said, well, we can't, the U.S. government can't be doing that. We can't be attacking. I don't like what Castro's doing down there, but it's not the United States' job to dictate what kind of governments other countries have. And they said...
So I guess it was Kennedy's perspective that it's not the U.S.'s job to dictate what governments other countries have.
Well, as soon as they land, there's going to be a big revolution. Everybody's going to rise up, and they're going to overthrow Castro. And he said, well, you can't use the U.S. military. And they ended up bringing those guys over with United Fruit boats. And in the middle of it, in the night, they came to him and said, they're getting wiped out on the beach, and you need to send in the military and invade. And he said, we're not going to do it. And he stepped out of that meeting. And he realized they had been lying to him and trying to trick him. And he said, I want to take the CIA and shatter it into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. And then, for the next 1,000 days of his presidency, he was at war with his military and intelligence apparatus. They tried to get him to go into Laos. He said no. They tried to get him to go into Vietnam with combat troops. They said that we need 250,000 combat troops. He refused. Everybody around him wanted him to go into Vietnam. He sent 16,000 military.
All right, so I don't know much about the CIA in Cuba in relation to President John F. Kennedy, but pertaining to Vietnam, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. here talks as if President Kennedy just came into the Oval Office, just waltzed on into the presidency, knowing jack shit about what was going on in Vietnam, and suddenly found out that the CIA and the military-industrial complex were trying to trick and swindle him into getting into a war in Vietnam. Or is it possible that during this time, the United States had a foreign policy called containment, where they wanted to stop the spread of communism as much as possible, mixed with a bit of Wilsonian nation building? For example, there was, in 1954, the French colony of Indochina, they were in a bit of a pickle because some dork by the name of Ho Chi Minh was trying to fight for independence from France so that he could establish a communist dictatorship in the region. And in April of 1954, while the Battle of Dien Bien Phu was underway, a United States senator gave a speech addressing then-President Dwight D. Eisenhower, saying one alternative is a negotiated peace based on either upon partition of the area between the forces of the Viet Minh and the French Union possibly along the 16th parallel, or based on a coalition government in which Ho Chi Minh is represented. Despite any wishful thinking to the contrary, it should be apparent that the popularity and prevalence of Ho Chi Minh and his following throughout Indochina would cause either partition or a coalition government to result in eventual domination by the communists. The second alternative is for the United States to persuade the French to continue their valiant and costly struggle, an alternative which, considering the current state of opinion in France, will be adopted only if the United States pledges increasing support. Secretary of State Dullah's statement that the imposition in Southeast Asia of the political system of Communist Russia and its Chinese Communist ally should be met by united action indicates that it is our policy to give such support, that we will, as observed by the New York Times last Wednesday, fight, if necessary, to keep Southeast Asia out of their hands, and that we hope to win the support of the free countries of Asia for united action against communism in Indochina, in spite of the fact that such nations have pursued since the war's inception a policy of cold neutrality. I think it is important that the Senate and the American people demonstrate their endorsement of Mr. Dullah's objectives, despite our difficulty in ascertaining the full significance of its key phrases. Certainly, I, for one, favor a policy of united actions by many nations whenever necessary to achieve a military and political victory for the free world in that area, realizing full well that it may eventually require some commitment of our manpower. And that senator happened to be a senator from the great state of Massachusetts by the name of John F. Kennedy. Now, in all fairness, and you can see it right here, this is a source from the JFK library. And as you can see, he immediately goes on to say, but to pour money, material, and men into the jungles of Indochina without at least a remote prospect of victory would be dangerously futile and self-destructive. JFK does go on to explain all the nuances and stressing that the United States should be careful and really consider the implications of getting involved. But it sounds like as early as 1954, he was very interested in helping the cause of containing communism, keeping communism out of Vietnam. And there was even another speech that John F. Kennedy gave in 1956. I think this was to the Friends of Vietnam. As you can see right here, this is also put up on the JFK Library's website. John F. Kennedy says, Vietnam represents a test of American responsibility and determination in Asia. If we are not the parents of little Vietnam, then surely we are the godparents. We presided at its birth, we gave assistance to its life, we have helped to shape its future. As French influence in the political, economic, and military spheres has declined in Vietnam, American influence has steadily grown. This is our offspring. We cannot abandon it. We cannot ignore its needs. And if it falls victim to any of the perils that threaten its existence, communism, political anarchy, poverty, and the rest, then the United States, with some justification, will be held responsible, and our prestige in Asia will sink to a new low. So it's not like President Kennedy was just aloof about what was going on in Vietnam and was suddenly getting swindled into another war so that weapons contractors could make some money. From what I could tell, President Kennedy was a loud advocate for getting the United States involved in Vietnam in the first place in an effort to stop the spread of communism. And even going back to the 1956 speech, this speech is, Kennedy really stresses the importance of American influence throughout the world to stop the spread of communism. And I don't say this to defend John F. Kennedy or be a contrarian against the military-industrial complex types or to defend U.S. foreign policy. I think there is plenty of legitimate criticism to go around when discussing U.S. foreign policy during this time. And I guess this is the point. I guess this is why I'm talking about this, because who needs these wacky theories about the military-industrial complex when we have a perfect opportunity to learn from the mistakes and bad ideas pertaining to foreign policy? And in all fairness to Robert F. Kennedy Jr., I think he mentions that JFK was not willing to commit combat troops. And from what I can tell, John F. Kennedy did want to avoid committing combat troops to the Vietnam effort. And I'm basing this off of a book that I dusted off this week for this segment called America's Longest War by George C. Herring. And in the book, it talks about how Kennedy, he was trying to find some pragmatic, middle-of-the-ground solution strategy to how to handle Vietnam, because John F. Kennedy was in a very difficult position when he was president. On one hand, President Kennedy did not want to commit ground troops, not out of some noble principle to avoid bloodshed, because I think the 1954 speech, if you recall, he seems open to the idea of committing manpower to the effort. But President Kennedy did not want the American public to think that they were getting dragged into another war, another quagmire. And he knew that sending combat troops to Vietnam would probably be unpopular. Keep in mind, he barely won the 1960 presidential election. That was a very close election between him and Richard Nixon. On the other hand, the Soviet Union and Nikita Khrushchev during this time, they were flexing their muscles, building walls in Berlin, committing to helping the liberation of colonized countries. Kennedy already had to compromise on Laos, and he was already getting embarrassed with how Cuba played out. And I guess John F. Kennedy felt that Nikita Khrushchev and the Soviet Union were not taking him that seriously, and he also did not want to look weak in front of his political opponents at home. So he tried to find this middle-of-the-road strategy like, okay, we're not going to commit combat troops, but maybe if we send a few thousand advisors and personnel to train these South Vietnamese troops, send a few thousand personnel to assess the situation, if we dump a little more foreign aid to build hospitals and roads, maybe that will give the South Vietnamese hope and confidence. And maybe that will send a message to the communist regimes that America means business.
Advisors has fewer people than he sent to get James Meredith into Ole Miss in Jackson, Mississippi, to get one black man into school. He sent fewer in Vietnam. They weren't allowed to fight. Many of them did. They violated the rules of engagement.
And here Robert Kennedy is admitting that JFK did increase military personnel to South Vietnam, but he's trying to underplay it.
In October of 1963, he heard that some of his Green Berets had been killed over there. And he said, I want a total casualty list from Vietnam. And his aide came to him and said, 75 Americans have died. He said, that's too many. And he signed that day a national security order ordering all troops out of Vietnam, U.S. troops. The first 1,000 over the next month, and then the rest by the beginning of 1965. And then a month later, he was killed. So,
So let's talk about this executive order where Kennedy apparently planned a withdrawal from Vietnam. Because I guess this has been the subject of dispute and debate amongst historians for decades. And I looked it up on Wikipedia, which then cited this source where I'm pretty sure this is the official memorandum. But before I get into that, I also found this New York Times article from 1997 written by Tim Weiner. And this New York Times article talks about how no one will ever know whether these plans would have been carried out had Kennedy lived. The United States had 16,300 advisors in South Vietnam at the time. By the end of 1968, it had more than 500,000 soldiers in the country. Historians know that Kennedy directed the Pentagon to devise the withdrawal plans, but some believe that they were a political facade erected for the 1964 elections. Others think they were based on overly optimistic battlefield reports. Still, others see them as a device to force South Vietnam's corrupt government to change. And even the Herring book talks about this. Twice. The first time, Herring says such interpretations are at best highly speculative. From the outset, the idea of troop withdrawals was designed as a political ploy to appease the American public and reassure the South Vietnamese. The extent to which Kennedy was committed to the withdrawal remains quite unclear, and there is not a shred of evidence to support the notion of a secret plan for extrication. Even if he had made such a commitment, it is a sad commentary on his leadership that he was willing to risk additional American lives in a cause he considered hopeless merely to ensure his re-election. And before I get into the second citation of this book where they talk about this issue, I do want to bring up the official memorandum. I think we do need to consider the fact that the executive order was conditional on the South Vietnamese military being able to fend for themselves. It says right here, it remains the central object of the United States in South Vietnam to assist the people and government of that country to win the contest against the externally directed and supported communist conspiracy. The test of all decisions and U.S. actions in this area should be the effectiveness of their contributions to this purpose. And I think a reason to be skeptical over whether or not President Kennedy would have withdrawn had he lived is the fact that just 1 month after this executive order, there was a military coup in South Vietnam which further destabilized the region. And from what I can tell, many historians acknowledge this as a major turning point in Vietnam. Going back to the Herring book, he says at another point, what Kennedy might have done can never be known for certain, of course, and his administration must be judged on what it actually did during its brief tenure. The president and most of his advisors uncritically accepted the assumption that a non-communist South Vietnam was vital to America's global interests, and their rhetoric, in fact, strengthened the hold of that assumption. That the president never devoted his full attention to Vietnam, as his defenders claim, seems clear. He reacted to crises and improvised responses on a day-to-day basis, seldom examining the implications of his actions. Although apparently troubled by growing doubts, he refused, even after the problems with Diem had reached a crisis point, to face the hard questions. John F. Kennedy's cautious middle course significantly enlarged America's role and commitment in Vietnam. Like most of his advisors, he acted on the arrogant presumption that the United States knew what was right for Vietnam. Quote, in the name of the struggle against the Viet Cong, Ellen Hammer has written, the Americans claimed the right to intervene as they chose, unquote, and overthrew the Diem government primarily because it resisted their advice. Herring goes on to say, with the coup, the United States assumed direct responsibility for the South Vietnamese government. Whatever his fears or his ultimate intentions, Kennedy bequeathed to his successor a problem eminently more dangerous than the one he had inherited. So I'm not sure that President Kennedy would have committed to withdrawing troops. Either way, I think all of this rhetoric and emphasis over the military-industrial complex, I think it's a distraction from talking about flawed and clearly consequential foreign policy ideas.